Hello and welcome back. In the last video we jointed and glued the top up. Now that it's dried for several hours, we're going to go ahead and take the clamps off and cut it to size and surface the top, plane and scrape both the top and the bottom, and we'll do a little edge treatment as well. So we'll begin by taking the clamps off here. Whenever I glue up a tabletop or even a chest of drawers, side, a blanket chest, I do it in exactly the same fashion. It's oversized in the length and it's oftentimes oversized in the width. So the first step to preparing a panel is to narrow it down to get it to the size in the width. So we'll do that first. Now generally when I'm gluing up a tabletop or as I mentioned, a blanket chest side or something of that nature, oftentimes you're going to have multiple pieces that are glued together. If that's the case, I really generally don't worry about, sizing each one of the pieces to the exact same width. However, we have a two-piece top here. I would like to, just for the sake of consistency or uniformity here, we'll have that center seam somewhat in the center, as opposed to measuring from this side here. This is that side that we jointed previously. Instead of measuring from this side over like this, again this top is 15 inches square, so if I measure from this side, you can see what happens. It'll put this board, make this board smaller and this board wider. Again, that's generally not a problem, especially if you have a multiple glue ups. But again, being that we have two pieces here, I'd like to just make 7.5 inches on either side of the center line. So we'll start by doing that. I'm going to mark, we'll just start with one side. I'm going to mark 7.5 inches over here, and 7.5 inches over there. And then we'll join those two marks. And remove the material. If there's only a little bit of material to remove, you can actually just hand plane that material away, or even use a draw knife. If there's, if you have 1/4 of an inch or something, you could just take a draw knife and peel it away. If you have a substantial amount, you could just hand saw it off, and then of course you'd be able to save that piece. Chances are I'm not going to do too much with this piece. I could just draw knife it off, but let me show you how I would rip it off using a rip saw. I went ahead in the last video and cleaned this up so you would see the typical process for joining up a tabletop in preparing for ripping it to size and sizing it down. I've secured the piece here between the tail vise, added an extra support using a holdfast. Now I'm going to rip it off. I'm going to rip on the waist side of the line using a rip saw. I'm just going to finish up this last little bit. As we get towards the end, I'll hear the tone difference and just lighten up on the saw, and the last little bit comes off. So I've cut on the outside of the line. I've actually left the line. Generally you have to with a rip saw. The teeth are generally a little bit more coarse. So now what I've got to do is plane to the line. If I stick this upright in the vise like this is a little bit higher than what I'm comfortable with. I'd be up here like this, my plane would be up here like this. What I'm actually going to do is put it down lower in the vise. Of course, this does pose some potential problems in that if you put it off on the edge of the vise could rack. And that is, it could cant a little bit like this, and sometimes this will pivot. There's a couple solutions there. You can simply take a clamp and clamp it across the bench like this. Like this. Thus securing your work. Or you could have us make you a bench and you can have a sliding dead man on your bench, which is a wonderful attachment here. You just slide this part right up and put a hold fast in here like this. Tighten it down, and now it's secure. I've started by using the scrub plane because I cut a little bit more on the outside of the line, and so this will bring it down closer to the line. Then I'll come back with either the number 6 or the number 8 plane like we discussed in the last video for jointing it. I'm going to use my number 6 plane now for working right down to the line. Now that I've got one edge nice and straight, and it is parallel to this joint, making this joint right in the center, let's go ahead and cut the top to width. Again, that's the first step before we cut it to length. You always want to cut it to width, making sure we have a flat edge right here to reference off of. Some might prefer to just run it through the table saw, which would also work as well. If you have a flat edge there, you run it through the table saw with this part up against the fence. That would rip this to size. I would recommend that you go a little bit oversized so you can hand plane away the saw marks. We'll do it by hand. We'll just take the rule here and we'll mark it right at 15. Actually, I'm going to mark it just a little bit over. Give myself about a 32nd of an inch. And we'll just mark this side. And then this side here. Okay. The next step is just to go ahead and rip that off in exactly the same fashion that I did last time. Put it here in the vise. I'm just cleaning up the final edge with the hand plane, and then we can begin cutting it to length. The first step to cutting it to length is to start by marking one side. This one side needs to be perfectly square to a referenced edge. Of course, it'd be ideal to make sure that this referenced edge was square. Let's check that. We'll pick the one that we're most happy with. This one looks nice and square. I'm going to mark this. Obviously is my face, and this is my front square edge. So we're going to work off of this edge when we square the two ends. Let's start with one end first. Now, you can see we're going to put this on here. Let's just check the overall length because I want to determine how much extra waste I have. Whenever I'm making a panel, I generally allow myself 1 to 2 inches in length oversize. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to cut off too much on one end. So let's measure it here. It's 16 inches, so that gives me 1 inch, because I know I want it 15 inches square. That gives me 1 inch of extra material. So let's start by just trimming one side. Now you'll see if I put my square up here, it doesn't go all across the board. Now I really don't want to work it from this end, just in case there's a slight discrepancy in these 2 points being parallel. If I work from this one edge, then I'll be for certain that this should be square to this edge. What we're going to do is we're going to take a straight edge like this, and position it just like that. You see how I'm rubbing it up against the side of the square, making sure that it's making nice contact there. The square is up against the edge, and we'll go ahead and we'll mark one side here. Now there's a couple things you can do. You can make a knife edge right along that and bring that knife edge around. That is if you wanted a nice crisp, clean cut here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little round over on the edge, maybe even a little chamfer on it, so it will take up any slight tear out that we might have from the saw. Let's go ahead and cross cut it. I'm going to turn to a crosscut saw for cross cutting. This is a longer panel saw, a nice crosscut saw, and we'll go ahead and cross cut this. Now it's a little bit more difficult here to cut away this little bit of material. It's difficult because the saw may want to tend to flex and it could break the piece off. It's sometimes difficult to control. If you're going to cut off something like this and you're not comfortable cutting off this little bit, maybe take a little bit more off or allow yourself a little bit longer so you have a little more waste to cut off. Put your finger on the side like this, on the side. Don't ever put your fingers underneath. Although these saws do stop, you will end up cutting yourself. Nice and controlled. You see I'm putting my hand here on the side, pushing against the side of the saw to try to keep that right in line. Use the entire length of the saw. Sometimes the saw will want to steer into the cut or away from the cut. You're going to have to control that. You're going to have to steer the saw, essentially. You may have to twist it a little bit like this or a little bit like this. But take your time. Don't rush it. You'll notice what I'm doing here. This piece here is loose on this side, and it could have the tendency to break off. So what I'm doing is I'm putting my finger against that side, pushing against the saw plate, and it just stiffens it and helps it secure it. It also is a nice way to support the saw. It's especially important when you're getting near the end here that you lighten up on the saw. Don't bear down on the saw. If you bear down on the saw, it can tend to break this part out right here. So we're going to lighten up on the saw. There we go. Now a lot of times people are concerned with this edge joint. They might say, well, is that strong enough? And I like to illustrate this. Now keep in mind that this is actually glued the entire length right here. So you have glue surface over that entire length. And we've just taken off a piece of wood that's 3/16 of an inch in thickness. Now what I like to do is I like to just take my fingers, I'm taking my fingers right over the top of that joint, and we're going to break it and watch what happens. It does not break on the actual glue joint. The wood actually breaks. And that's just 3/16 of the top. This top is glued the entire length, the entire, well, 15 inches here. So that's how strong the glue is. Now that I've cut this end, the next step is to plane this edge. Now, planing end grain can present a few difficulties. Again, if you remember from watching some of the other videos, we talk in depth about the straws and these fibers going up like this. If I was to take my plane and plane all the way across here, you can clearly see what's going to happen. The end grain is going to break. So what you've got to do is you've got to work from two directions. You've got to work in this way and before you go off the edge, you've got to come back this way. There's a couple different planes that you can use for this. You can use any one of these beveled down planes. You can use the number 6 here as long as it's sharp and as long as it's secured lower in the vise. I don't want it up high like this because it can tend to vibrate and such. Now, you'll notice I'm just going to plane this. This part's a little bit high, so we're going to work this. One of the enjoyable things about woodworking I find fascinating is the different shavings that come off of the plane. You can see this one here. This is just end grain walnut shavings. It has an iridescent look. That's end grain, which is really, to me, that's just amazing. You can hold it up to the light and see even the cellular fibers right in.
Left hand around towards me. Like, great, yeah.
I'm working this part down. The plane is squeaking a little bit, and there's a couple reasons why. One is because of vibration. You see how it's a little bit higher, and it's really clamped over here. I could put an additional clamp on this side, but another little trick that I found is using a little bit of paste wax. I prefer the Minwax paste wax as it's a semi-hard substance, not super soft, but still soft enough that it goes on to the plane just fine. This really helps glide the plane along the surface and works wonderful. End grain shavings. I'm going to come in from this side and work back this way. Nice and smooth all the way across. Maybe one more stroke. Nice. We're ready now to mark the other side, but we want to check this to make sure that it's square. It's not super important on this tabletop, which is going to be free floating, and it's not like it's referenced off of a specific edge necessarily. It's more important though if you were making a case piece like a dresser or a blanket chest, something like that. You'd want this to be perfectly square. So we can check that and see how close we are. It's very easy to adjust. If it's a little bit off, it's very easy to adjust. So we can take it and just look at it. You can see we're a little bit high right over on this end, but we can work that down by just planing that edge. So we'll just plane this edge is just a little bit high. We'll work that down, making it nice and square. Oftentimes, it doesn't really take very much. You'll notice I'm not planing the entire width of the board. I'm working more in this area and then lifting the plane up. Let's check it again. That looks good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the top to final length. And we'll do that by simply just taking the straight edge and measuring from the end here. You can use a ruler, a straight edge, whatever you have. 15, let's go 15 and a 32nd or so. And we can do the same thing over here, just like that. Of course, there's our reference edge, so we'll go ahead and take our square and put this on just like this and bring it right up to that line, just like that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can actually take a knife and score across this if you want to eliminate some tear out. Didn't really get any tear out on this side, but you can really take a knife and just take it like this, holding the straight edge down. If you have a really wide piece, you can just clamp one end and then hold it down. The secret here is I'm holding the straight edge down and then putting very light pressure with the knife. That way it doesn't move the straight edge out of the way. Once that line is established, you can move the straight edge out of the way and go right over the top of it. You can carry that knife line around to the other side if you prefer, and again, that just basically would help eliminate any tear out. Now we're going to cross cut this, but there are different methods that you can use. If you don't feel comfortable with using the saw, or maybe you have a machine that you'd like to use, you can actually cut this with the bandsaw. If you cut this, you could make all of these cuts with the bandsaw. If you stay on the outside of the line, just cut on the outside of the line and then use a hand plane to finish up to the line. Now that I've cut the other end here, I'm ready to hand plane the surface and clean that up. I thought I'd introduce to you another means of clamping the tabletop. This vise was originally designed and developed by Joseph Moxon back in the 1700s, and it's one that we make here and sell. You can buy this vise from us. There's other places you can buy it. Benchcrafted.com sells one with metal hardware. This is a wonderful vise. I've got it clamped here between the dogs on my tail vise with a hold down to clamp it down. You can also just clamp it to any flat, sturdy surface by clamping it either here on the sides or on the front as well. The great thing about this vise is that I can set the top down inside here like this, and it secures it. There's a clamp on this side and on this side as well. So now it secures it, minimizing or reducing all vibration. So we can plane the surface. The other thing that this vise is great for is for cutting dovetails on a chest of drawers or a blanket chest. You can drop the whole side down in here. It secures it. So you really can build even a piece of furniture, or even this table, using just this vise. So this vise and of course a sturdy bench. Let me show you how I plane this with no vibration. There we go. Now that I've cut the top to size, I'm happy with the edges. I've planed all the edges here. I am going to do some edge treatment on the edges, that is to cut the edge here. We're going to go ahead and work on the surface here. Could actually work on the bottom surface, which might not be a bad idea to start with. That way you can kind of practice some of the techniques that I'm going to demonstrate here. There's a couple ways to deal with this. I am assuming that you have pre-planed your stock, that is, you've jointed it, you've planed it, so it should be the same thickness all the way. That's something you do prior to gluing up. So there might be some slight variation in the joint height right here. There might be some slight variation this way. And if there's a lot, we could actually come in with a hand plane and smooth it. The problem with using a hand plane on a top like this is you have grain difference, especially on a multi-panel top where you've got multiple pieces of wood glued together. You'll have grain difference. There's a couple ways to deal with that. Let's start by removing a little bit of the excess glue with a card scraper here. And I like to do that just because the glue can tend to dull the planes, and I'll just work some of that glue off with the scraper. This surface is actually ready to go right to a cabinet scraper, but if your surface had some major areas that needed to be worked on, you can actually use a plane. Now, if it was real bad, you'd want to use a longer plane, but as I mentioned earlier, we have already flattened and surfaced this material. It's all the same thickness, and it's already been flattened. However, if you need to bring it down, maybe you have some slight variation when you glued it up, a little bit off. You can use the plane by working diagonally. Well, why would I work diagonally? Why wouldn't I just work straight across? Well, as I mentioned, if you have multiple pieces glued together, you might have some grain going like this, some grain going like that, and you're guaranteed to have tear out. By working across the grain diagonally, you can minimize that tear out. So you see what I'm doing here? I'm working across the grain. Now, I didn't say eliminate the tear outs. Occasionally you will still have some tear out, but you can minimize the tear out by working diagonally across the grain. I'll at times even work absolutely perpendicular to the grain, just going straight across like that. But I've found that diagonally about 45, 60 degrees or so tends to be a nice angle to be planing at. I've got a little bit of variation there, and we can just kind of work this. You'll also notice that my plane really is not set very deep. It's set quite fine because we're just smoothing the surface here, bringing it all down. I'm also using a 4.5 plane because this is a smaller top. Really, this top doesn't have to be dead flat or anything. It's just, you know, even if you feel the surface on a piece of period furniture, that is a piece that was made 200 or 300 years ago, you will definitely feel slight undulations in the surface. I'm going to turn now to the cabinet scraper. The way I'm going to do this is starting off the edge of the board. We're going to angle it like this, putting pressure here. I'm going to come in. I've got a lot of upper body pressure going down, and we're going to get behind it like this and push it in like this. Okay? There's a couple ways you could do this. You could work like this. I could even turn the piece in the vise and work that way, which might be a better option, mainly because all of the pressure is going to be going in this direction, which would be going directly against my clamp here. So whatever you're comfortable with here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start off the edge of the board like this with the scraper, pressure here, and angling the scraper, and we're going to come in. I've got a lot of upper body downward pressure like this. I've even got my feet spread apart. They're braced here, and we're going to come in like this, but not go off the edge of the board. We're going to stop before we go off the edge of the board. The reason why is because if I go off the edge of the board, I can leave a little tear out. So we'll stop there. But when we stop, in the motion, we'll lift up the back of the scraper, leaving the front in contact, and then bring it back like this. And it will sever that chip. You'll see here. Like this. So you see, while I'm working in the motion, the back of the scraper lifts up. You see how it lifts up there? But I'm still moving, and what that does is that severs the chip. So you can work it like this from one end to the other. This is the exact same technique that I use if I'm surfacing a 6 or a 7-foot tabletop or a 15-inch top. It's exactly the same process. It just takes a little bit longer on a bigger surface. This is a good way to get your morning exercise or afternoon exercise. You see how I'm working from one side across here, then back this way. Now that I've worked in like this, I'm going to come back from this direction and go this way. By the way, if your scraper is not producing shavings like this, go back and watch the video that we did on sharpening your cabinet scraper. Now all we've got to do is, again, working it at an angle like this, and then as I go in, we straighten the scraper and then lift up the back. Here we go. There it is. I don't know what I would do without my Stanley number 80 cabinet scraper. Produces a beautiful finish. Now we've got a little bit of a glue mark right here. I've got to get rid of that. That's a little bit of maybe the glue mixed with the iron and the clamp, creates a little spot, and there's a little divot there. We'll take that out as well. I like to call this tool the hand tool belt sander. The only exception here is that this tool is not scratching the surface, so we don't have any scratches to worry about. You can come back with the card scraper and smooth up the surface, bringing an even texture. Ah, look at that. Now that I've finished the bottom side, let's turn our attention to the top. I've turned it in the vise as I feel more comfortable with it in this configuration, working this way for this size top. If it was a bigger top, I'd obviously have to do it this way. So I'm going to start by just card scraping. Then I'm going to go straight to the cabinet scraper here. And you'll notice I'm starting off and working in like this. I've turned it around now, and now I'm going to work in, because when I worked this side, I didn't go all the way off the edge because I didn't want to tear up this edge. So now I'm going to come in and work this way. Starting from one side, working across the board. This actually goes very fast, as you can see. And that's it for the cabinet scraper. Again, just a couple passes with the card scraper to clean it up. And I have surfaced this top. I'm happy with this. No scratches, no tear out, just a nice, clean top. Now, I don't mind if you go over it with a little bit of 220 sandpaper to just bring a uniform surface texture. The other thing about sandpaper too is, and occasionally, if there is some tear out, the dust will fall in to the little bit of tear out and highlight it. And then all you got to do is just go back with the scraper right over the top of it and scrape just that area. Being that I didn't use a plane on this and just a scraper, I don't see any tear out. Before I spend too much time sanding the top, I want to talk about the edge treatment. I want to draw here on the board a couple different options for doing the edge treatment. That's something that you may overlook or not even think about necessarily, but we've got the square edge right there that we worked on. So I'm going to draw a couple options here. We've got the edge of the table right like this. So we can take and just simply do a little round over right there. That is on these edges right here. You can actually do a little chamfer, and you can do a bevel on the back. That's actually one that I like. I like to do a nice bevel on the bottom there, and a little round over on the top, easing the edge. You can even divide this into thirds and do even like a round over here and a round over there. So that there's many different ways to treat the edge, and this is what you would do all the way around the top. One thing that you want to keep in mind though is the overhang of the top. If you are going to do a bevel right there, you don't want to do that bevel too far in where it would interfere with the aprons and legs of the table. There's actually 1 1/8" overhang for the top over the table. So if I was going to bevel this back, I wouldn't want to go any more than 1 inch over. I might show you that method. Again, this is the bottom, and we could take off just 1/3, so I basically divide this into thirds, and I just bevel it back up 1/3 and over 1 inch. Essentially, we're making like a raised panel, but on the bottom. What that does is it lightens up the top, gives it a more elegant look, and then we can simply do a little round over right there on the top. Let's begin by laying out that 1 inch bevel. I'll set my square to 1 inch, and then just take a pencil or a pen, if you can see the pen's a little bit easier to see on the walnut, and carry that around like this. We'll do that on all 4 sides, just like this, carrying it around. You can also use a pencil gauge like I have here. I'll set this to 1 inch. I took an old marking gauge and drilled a hole in it and put a pencil in there. This works great because you can just take it and run it along the edge like this. I find this tool to be invaluable for marking, especially where you wouldn't necessarily want a point to interfere here. So this is marked on the bottom, 1 inch over. Remember, the top overhangs the apron by 1 1/8 inches. So 1 inch there. Now let's take it on the edge, and we'll divide this into thirds. And I'm just going to do that by eye. You could use a pair of dividers if you like, but again, this is just visual. So we'll just take this and bring the gauge right up to about 1/3 from the bottom here, and we'll carry this line around as well. Of course, it's a little bit difficult to see on the walnut, but I'll just make that line a little heavier. There we go. So now you can see here, we've got 1 inch over and then 1/3 this way. Now I've got to bevel that off. I want to start on the end grain just like we did when we did the box top. We started by skewing the plane and working the end grain. Now I can configure this right in the vise like this and use, well, you guessed it, the 4.5 plane. I'll set it a little deeper and we'll skew it like this. Now why am I not going up like this? Listen to the difference. You hear the difference there versus this? Big difference. Again, think about the straws. Again, here's the straws like this. We're planing with the straws as opposed to against the straws. I'm going to set the plane a little deeper and just to remove the bulk of the material. Again, skewing the plane. I can do this in sections too. I don't have to come at a perfect angle. I can do a facet this way, a facet back that way, and then join them together. So I'm working this facet right close to the line. Then we'll work this one, set the plane a little deeper. I've got a lot of wood to remove, so why not just set the plane a little deeper and hog the wood off. That's a technical term. Okay, now I'm going to back the plane off as we get closer to the line, because one fell swoop with the plane set deep and we can really go past our line very quickly. Sometimes I will go straight across the grain like this, and just right at the end I'll turn it like this. The reason why I'm doing that is because I'm trying to keep that bevel flat. By working across like this, there's more contact of the plane on the bevel. Now that I'm very close to the line, we're going to back the plane off even more. You can actually come back this way. Again, my goal here is to keep the plane as flat as I can. There we have it. That's how we do the bevel. I'll do the exact same thing on the other side, and then the two edges. Can you tell that my plane is dull? No? Now I'm going to do the two edges. You can actually come in with a number 5. Again, the plane that I have configured to a scrub configuration, that is just rounded on the edge here. And I'm going to bulk away, or technical term, hog off the material with this plane. You just want to make sure that you don't get too close to the line with this plane. So as soon as you get close, just stop. Then you can turn your attention to this plane, because as I mentioned, one swipe with the plane set heavy and you'll mess it up. Now the key here is getting these corners to line up perfectly. I've just sharpened my plane, and now I'm going to go back and just finish up this chamfer. One of the keys here, the secret to doing these chamfers and getting these corners to line up, is to back the plane off. Actually, there's two secrets. One is a sharp blade, and the other is to back the blade off. So I'm going to back the blade off as we get closer here, because one fail swoop with the plane, if it's set too deep, and you can go way past the line. So let's back the blade way off. There we go. Back it off and watch those lines come together. Our goal is to take this corner and bring it all the way down to there. You can see we have just a little bit more to go, but I also want to keep in mind, I want to watch this back one here and make sure that I don't go too far there. You see how the plane is set very fine. And there we have it. It's almost there. Is it there yet? If you go too far past the line, you can actually just come back and work it back coming this way to bring it together. Now that I've chamfered the bottom edge here, we can now turn our attention towards the top edge right up here and do our little round over. We can go ahead and stick that in the Moxon vise or the front vise, whatever method you prefer, and we'll go ahead and plane that using the same technique that we used when we did the box, where we started with the end grain. I've got it set here in the Moxon vise, and now I'm going to work the edge with the plane. You can take off as little or as much as you want here. I like to at least just ease the edge. That breaks the edge, and it also keeps you from the edge from getting damaged. You see how I'm skewing it along, making those nice little curled shavings. I'm going to do the other end grained section as well.
There we have it. We can finish up by just lightly touching these bevels and the edges with some sandpaper, some 220 grit sandpaper. This edge is a little bit hard. I'll just lightly touch this edge with some sandpaper and ease that edge just a little bit. And that completes the top. We can now turn our attention to the buttons, which will hold the top in place, will secure the top, and then we get to put some oil on our finished table.